Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for Svalarheima's Winter Force. In this video, we'll be going through who Svalarheima are, how they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and identity before jumping into Infinity Army to go through the profiles that showcase the faction. Now, because Winter Force is, at least to me, kind of a simple-ish faction to explain, we're also going to take a little bit of time at the end of the video to go through perhaps half a dozen regiments in Svalarheima that are not necessarily particularly relevant to how they play in N4, but have considerable potential in the transition to N5. Now, I'm not necessarily going to be making that assessment based on any secret or hidden knowledge, it's just sort of based on what we know so far. It is very much a vibes-based assessment, but there are many things about the game that we know will be changing, and just on pass-through of the sectoral, picking out profiles to talk about for this video, these are ones that kind of leapt out to me as at least regiments to watch. This is not a guaranteed stonks go up situation, but I'm certainly going to be keeping an eye on these few profiles as the edition shifts, and you might want to as well. As always, before we begin, big thanks to channel supporters who make videos like this possible, including in this case a number of people who've requested this, but in particular Trent. Trent currently lives in a part of Australia that is as far from being Svalarheima as possible, and actually requested this video an embarrassingly long time ago. I had kind of convinced myself I'd recorded it already, but when I went back to check to actually find where is this Svalarheima faction focus that I've done, I couldn't find it. So we're doing it now. And with that, let's turn our minds to who are Svalarheima's Winter Force. Now, Svalarheima are obviously one of Pan-Oceania's sectoral, and they are one of the sectorals that kind of leads me to my general appraisal of Pan-Oceanian sectorals, that many of them play as Pan-Oceania but with X, Pan-Oceania but with some kind of thing that makes them interesting or different or unique, but all adhering to the basic Pan-Oceanian game plan. And in the case of Svalarheima Winter Force, that is Pan-Oceania, firepower superiority, big guns, higher ballistic skill than other people, but with close assault. And that means that the general game plans for Svalarheima is just kind of very clean and neat. You have the biggest guns, you bring the biggest guns, you win the firepower superiority battle, and then when other Pan-Oceanian armies might try and figure out what they actually do to capitalize on that kind of environment, you just continue to go and kill them because you have close assault pieces that can follow up very cleanly on the suppressed enemy, all of the reduction in enemy overwatch fire. You can then just move in against this dug in or hidden enemy and engage them up close. There are a multitude of pieces in Winter 4 of mixed quality, but basically you will not want for things that can storm a breach and launch close assault actions in Svalarheima if you want them. And it's this basic game plan that really just is Svalarheima in a nutshell for me. That's it. That's the faction. Two really good things that go great together. You will never want for a way to spend your orders. You will never want for a clear action plan. If your opponent has things that are standing up, you shoot them until they sit down. And once all of your opponent's things are sitting down, you launch a close assault action with your solid quality close assault pieces. That's just a really good game plan. That just kind of works. Now, you can still do all of the other Pan-Oceanian things, i.e., I have made my opponent put their heads down, I am now going to spend 16 orders trying to roll whip 12 to press a button in the midfield. And of course, you have all of the usual Pan-Oceanian weaknesses. Your info war in this faction is very mediocre. It's going to be something like just a Fusilier hacker most of the time, if anything. The willpower of your specialist is generally going to be low, topping out at basically 13 with plenty of willpower 12. You won't hurt for specialists, but mission specialization is something that you'll kind of have to crowbar into lists a little bit in order to ensure that you don't just get dumpstered by a series of bad willpower rolls. Your doctor and your engineer are both going to be willpower 12 most of the time, which is why, as usual, God gave you command tokens to reroll that whip 12 roll 3 times so you don't accidentally kill your own Jotun. Overall, this makes Winter Force basically a very good beginner's introduction into Svalarheima or expansion from any of the other Pan-Oceanian factions if you're looking for something different. They slot very neatly into the Pan-Oceanian ecosystem. And while I think there would be less need for them if military orders was a more natural expansion from Pan-Oceania into close assault, the fact that military orders is, let's politely call it, very much its own beast, means that Svalarheima's existence is kind of very valuable to round out the Pan-Oceanian experience, And it kind of looks like that's something that will carry on into N5 as well. When we look at the vanilla Panoceanian roster, a lot of the like mercenary close assault pieces that had bled their way into the vanilla faction and had kind of just pushed out a lot of the things you would normally expect to have to use in Panoceania to bridge those gaps or even just accept that as a faction weakness. They've all been removed, but we have a very reasonable expectation, not having seen the roster yet, obviously, but I think we have a very reasonable expectation that many of those close assault pieces will stay in Svalarheima Winterforce. For example, I would broadly expect Liang Kai to stick around, and he is absolutely the best close assault piece in the faction, but even things like access to Hospitaller Knights, for example, which are not the greatest close assault piece in the game, but there is a conversation to have about the quality of them as close assault pieces. They will certainly still be present, as will like Gunnar, etc., Shona Carano, and so on. Now, in terms of other weaknesses that are worth mentioning in terms of Svalarheima that balance out the broad strengths that they have, and they do have like very broad strengths, having such a clean game plan, it is worth noting that they are a faction that is very limited in terms of other capabilities, like not just hacking, for example, but access to drop troops, no, access to camouflage midfield, technically yes, with the Beast Hunter. That's a model that may or may not stick around into N5. But these skirmishes that are available into Winter 4 generally are not what I would call high quality and are in fact kind of liabilities in the context of N4. That's what we call foreshadowing. We'll talk about them when we get to the final section. Overall, though, look, these weaknesses are not so significant as to make Svalarheimer anything but a very strong faction. They have a powerful, clean gameplay, they have great close assault, great gunfighting, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but particularly good mobility skills. There's plenty of super jump and climbing plus, not across the faction, but on the pieces of the faction that are important and usable in N4, which just means that you can always play the table, you can always shoot, you can always coast assault, you can always move, and that just makes them a good faction to play. If you are a beginner, then they will give you all of the tools you need to play all parts of the game, and if you are an experienced player, they have enough going on to allow for plenty of skill expression. This also means that if you are literally looking at buying into an army right now in the full knowledge that N5 is less than 3 weeks away, they're technically not the worst investment in the world because they will be in N5 and most of those strengths will probably carry over. But seriously, if you're looking at buying an army in the next 3 weeks, just wait. Just wait until N5 drops and then go and do that because there will be tons of things to look at and be excited about them. Anyway, that is my take on Svalarheimer Winterforce. To talk more, let's jump into Infinity Army. So we begin pretty much as we must, talking about links, and if we start talking about links, we start talking about Fusiliers. Fusiliers are a profile that I have spoken about many times in many different videos, but to just repeat those thoughts generally and in short here, Fusiliers are a fantastic base for a firepower link team, because they cost basically the same as everyone else's line troops but are ballistic skill 12. This means if you want a firepower ARO piece or even a build your own HMG, you've got a point of ballistic skill leg up over basically everyone else because of that Panoceanian +1 ballistic skill -1 willpower that you'll see on many Panoceanian profiles. Now, Fusiliers can make a very serviceable pure fire team core. I would generally avoid making a mixed core unless you are doing something like maybe dropping a Knight of Justice missile launcher in, basically because if you want to wildcard, you're going to be giving up N4 purity bonuses. There is really nothing that counts as a Fusilier. Now, that's totally fine, particularly if you're using Fusiliers as the platform for a Haris or 3-person core, which they work very well as because there are some very capable wildcards in Svalarheima. But I think Svalarheima, probably of all of the generic Panoceanian faction and sectorals, is the one I would most recommend kind of a hard castle aero firepower team in the form of Fusiliers. And that's because despite the fact that Svalarheima has excellent close assault and excellent firepower, they don't necessarily have outstanding close-in defense. Now, they're not completely absent those tools, but they don't have Varuna's Helots, they don't have Neoterra's Auxilia, they don't have Acontecemento's Mine Layers, for example, and so if you can connect with a Svalarheimer force in its deployment zone, you are very marginally more likely to get to the crunchy inner, or chewy inner center than you would against another faction in Pan-Oceania. And so for that reason, having strong ARO pieces that sort of help prevent your opponent getting to that stage just feels marginally more valuable. This means that in most Svalarheima lists that I write, I will be looking at either a missile launcher or a multi-sniper. The choice there is that missile launcher is cheaper and a little better as a pure ARO piece. The multi-sniper has less risk of being ranged in under because its range bands are a little cleaner, being good from 16 inches onward rather than 24 onwards with the missile launcher, and the multi-sniper's extra burst makes it better in active turn. If you want that kind of hybrid piece, go multi-sniper. If you just want a disposable ARO element, go missile launcher. But often I would suggest picking one of the two. You can pad your link team out with things like a paramedic, a couple of Fusilier generics, one of whom is the lieutenant, and then a hacker is not a bad choice to go into this link team. Like many other Pan-Oceanian factions, we can do things like put Fugazi drone bots into this list to stretch out our order pool, which means we will have some deployment zone repeaters, so even a willpower 12 6 sense hacker just helps provide some insurance against a line we didn't see being crossed across the table and a Sujan getting into our deployment zone. We are a little light on MSV pieces that I would be comfortable using as ARO pieces. Right, when we sort by MSV in Army looking at Svalarheima, there are some, in some cases, very solid quality pieces, but they're not pieces that I want to use as ARO elements, which means that it can be possible for your opponent to smoke out and close the distance, which means that just having a hacker is one more layer of defense that can help sort of neutralize the threat from a small number of pieces that you nevertheless don't want closing into a deployment zone and messing you up. If you're playing against something like a Sphinx, for example, Sphinxes are very expensive. I don't necessarily rate Sphinxes in general, but if a Sphinx is able to use its marker state to close and begin taking shots from an angle that you didn't see, just having that kind of deployment zone coverage from a hacker is worthwhile enough that, yes, technically it makes one member of your link team killable with a killer hacker. That is not the end of the world, and helping just close the loop on your defenses against some of those like real apex threats, Sujans, etc., can just kind of be worthwhile. So a very common link setup will be something like paramedic, hacker, gun, fusilier, lieutenant, decoy. It's solid, it is clean, it works, and it fits particularly well into Svalarheimer's game plan, which doesn't really want to be defending at short range. Now, in terms of like other fire teams, I think I actually in N4 kind of recommend that almost all of your fire teams just be Fusilier fire teams. Winterforce actually has an absolute wealth of different fire team options, which will probably translate very well into N5, but many of them in N4 are just expensive enough and just difficult enough to construct that, look, most of the time, a Haris that starts with Fusiliers and has some wildcards in it, and a core of Fusiliers is just a cleaner way of building your force that avoids bloating your army out, spending like 30 points on a model just to be a link filler. There are absolutely exceptions, and the experienced Valheimer players in the room will probably have a good idea of how they would operate using those exceptions. But if you're a new player, my advice is seriously just start with a 5-person Fusilier core and then a quote Fusilier Haris that makes lots of use of wildcards. And in terms of wildcards, it's the Kaho, fresh out of the White Company video that I literally did last week. It's this boy. He's great. He's in Winterfor, he's in White Company, and he is simultaneously one of the glassiest and most cannony glass cannons in the game. As I mentioned in the White Company video, you will absolutely feel at any time a Kaho loses a face-to-face roll, because it is single wound, armor 1. A combi rifle, a chain rifle, a shotgun, all of them will put this guy in the dirt. If you are lucky, you may be able to recover him. But the trade-off for all of that is Jesus Christ, the offensive power of the Feuerback. Now, while it is technically possible to get full core bonuses on a Kaho in Winterfor by having a Winterfor beta fire team comprising 3 Kaho, which is all that you're allowed, plus wildcarding in 2 more Kaho, which I'm pretty sure is legal, don't do that. Don't make that list. Yes, the Kaho Wereback will be Ballistic Skill 16 with all of its bonuses, etc. But the cheapest Kaho is 26 points and is single wound. You don't need to pay for 5 NCOs. Instead, Kaho should generally be used either as singleton pieces, because a Burst 3 Wereback with all of those modifiers is totally serviceable as a singleton element, or wildcarding into other teams, usually smaller teams. The Fusilier Harris that I mentioned, like, it's a very, very capable Harris team if you have something like a Fusilier Paramedic, maybe Agnes, who we'll talk about shortly, and then a Kaho. Now, when Winter 4 dropped, and for a little while afterwards, we saw things that were like 4 Kaho Fueback links lists, where every point of SWC that you had, all 6 SWC, was just spent on Kaho, because Kaho were good, so let's take the maximum possible number of them. Don't do that either. I think there's a very good argument that almost any Winter 4 list should include maybe at least one Kahu Fueback. You could even try and squeeze 2 in there, but at 35 points, they are too pricey really to spam, and they're too fragile to spam. Diversify your options, build in the ability to play a broader game plan. You do not want to run even 3 of these. 2 is a maybe in some lists. 1 is a great number, gives you a single NCO, that's great to have in any list, but once you start putting in multiple NCOs, you begin overpaying just for redundancy. And a little bit of that is fine, but do not overspend on these. Now, in terms of the other profiles, unlike in White Company, there's a little bit of merit in things like the Engineer and the Paramedic, and even the Emarat potentially. The Emarat is obviously a fearsome bit of close assault if you are going up against a target that it's vulnerable to, but it's more that in Winter Force, we have some actually really good quality, or we have a really good quality thing to engineer. We have 2 tags. One of them has remote presence, and remote presence makes even a willpower 12 engineer viable. So you could absolutely consider a Kahu engineer. It will do just an absolute ton of classifieds with decharges, engineer, multispectral visor, veteran troop, etc. And the paramedic is not the worst option either, because basically all Kahu, if you can engage with them in a good range band, are firepower superiority pieces. Whiteco, I don't think supports that kind of approach well enough, because Whiteco has a fragility problem. But in Svalarheima, you've got more access to pieces that are durable and can go a few rounds, and so I'm a little bit less wary of taking nearly 30-point single wound armor 1 pieces if they are doing something that is valuable. But most of the time, it will be the Fueback that you are taking in Winter for all of the same reasons that you do in White Company, i.e. because it's awesome. Now, having said that, most of our fire teams in an average Svalarheima list will probably be Fusilier links with wildcards added. Just to dwell briefly on duos, and in particular viable duos in Infinity N4, because I will have a bunch to say about N5 duos at the end of the video, we do want to pause and dwell on the superlative Blade Ops. Now, the Blade Ops in Svalarheima is not quite doing things that it can do in other sectorals in Pan-Oceania, because there is a limit to who it can link with, but it can absolutely link with Bulletiers, and there ain't nothing wrong with a Blade Ops Bulletier duo. I would usually, if you can find the SWC and points, go for the Spitfire, because the Blade Ops itself can do a little bit of close range work with the good ballistic skill mimetism and the submachine gun. The main thing you're doing with this kind of a duo, in addition to just having a bit of resilient gunfighting, the Bulletier obviously is just single wound, but if you can keep recovering it with the Blade Ops, then that's perfectly serviceable. But this is also a fire team that can do things like support a Jotun really well. It can keep up with the Jotun. Obviously, the Bulletier is quick enough. The Blade Ops is a little slower, but because the Blade Ops has tactical awareness, if the Jotun is moving around the board, even if it's just kind of strafing left or right in your deployment zone, the Blade Ops can redeploy to recover or heal it if it needs to. And if you can find the points for a Spitfire Blade Ops duo, what you are getting by replacing a machinist with that is that you are using troop slots much, much more aggressively. You are having less of a support budget, taking up space of your valuable 15 troopers, and pushing closer and closer to the kind of platonic ideal of 15 troops that could all theoretically win you the game if you need them to. Now, we will never get to that platonic ideal basically in any Pan-Oceanian list, because we will be taking things like Fugazi Dronbots just to cheerlead our other better, stronger troopers. We will be doing things like taking a 5-person Fusilier Corps in many lists, which locks 5 pieces in a mostly defensive kind of role. But because we're doing both of those things, any kind of way to fit in flexible, valuable, useful duos into a Svalarheima list or Panoceania list generally is something that is kind of worth pursuing if we can find the option, and the Blade Ops is a good option in Svalarheima. Now, in terms of other interesting, relevant wildcards to bulk out link teams with, we're going to sort of segue briefly through Agnes, who does actually deserve a little bit of a shout out. Now, even though Fusilier link teams will have 12-point paramedics, and you can just take a 12-point para, so 12-point paramedic and have it be a cheaper specialist than Agnes. There are a couple of things that just kind of make even the 14-point version of Agnes worth noting. The first is that she's willpower 13, and 13 is more than 12, often, perchance. But the other thing that's relevant here is that she has a template weapon. And if we are doing things like running Fusilier and Kaho, we don't necessarily, like, we could slot a close assault piece into that link if we've got a wild card, but the wild card close assault elements, which I will touch on immediately after Agnes, are a little pricey. And if we're looking to save points, but we still need to clear an objective room, for example, slapping Agnes on the pointy end of a link team and breaching the door with her gives us a burst 4 submachine gun forked with a burst 2 nanopulsar. And for 14 points, we don't really have anything in Svalarheima that can do that job better while also otherwise just being appropriately costed link filler. And so she kind of gets that shout out here just for occupying a niche that can be surprisingly easy to overlook. Now, on the much more expensive end of link filler that is very good in close assault, we have Shnarano, who is a melee expert that will not beat anti-melee expert pieces like the Uberfall Commando, but if you do get her into combat with something that you absolutely need dead and it's not a melee expert, anti-melee expert piece, she will delete it. For all of the reasons I've talked about in other videos, she just does massive, massive damage. And if we look at how martial arts are going to be changing in N5, she will do even more massive, massive damage. I think she'll be capable of forcing something like 8 saves to an enemy with an attack in N5 if all goes well, and it's pretty easy for her to actually deliver on that or nearly that result. She is an absolute tag deleter, and while in N4, in terms of, overall quality, she is perhaps not as efficient a piece as Lanai. Lanai can't join links in Winterforce, Shona Carano can, and so if you're looking for close assault, she is a good choice if you also want that close assault in a link team. Now, much pricier, but still worth mentioning, is Troll Hunter Gunnar Lundmark. Now, Gunnar is one of those pieces that, in general, on his broad merits, I would say not necessarily don't take, but take only judiciously, because he is cursed with way too many freaking rules. And the cost of all of those rules adds up, which is why we have 34 points for a model that only has Dogged, not no wound incapacitation, and I can't seem to see Shock Immunity anywhere in that 3-line list of skills that he has. Which means that as far as actually being durable goes, he's actually not hugely. But he does have Berserk and good close combat, and Natural Born Warrior and some martial arts, and the extremely valuable Tactical Awareness skill, and he's a specialist with Willpower 13, and he can gunfight quite serviceably in a pinch. And if we are playing Svalarheima, we are probably playing it because we are leaning into that theme of I'm going to have enough big guns to make you sit down and enough close assault to always be able to capitalize. And if we're playing that kind of a theme, it can just about be worth considering Troll Hunter Gunnar Lundmark after we have added a Beast Hunter and Shona Carano and Lanai, because too much of you can't have too much close assault once you have established enough firepower to guarantee you win the firepower battle. Once you've spent all of your SWC or thereabouts on big guns, we need something else. We need to spend our points on stuff that can go and kill the enemy because they are hiding, and Gunnar is like the 4th worst model in the faction for doing that. But tactical awareness is tactical awareness, and he is capable of doing it. Now, segueing out of models that can join Link Team, but which are still close assault pieces, it's Lanai. It is everybody's favorite close assault piece in every faction that he is able to join, and the man single-handedly responsible for multiple depressive episodes because he's leaving a bunch of those factions in N5. There is perhaps no piece in all of Infinity that is more of a do not, my friends, become addicted to Lanai. It will take hold of you and you will resent his absence more than Lanai. He is incredibly efficient. He is incredibly good at solving all sorts of problems. His skill loadout is very well optimized for being a missile straight into the enemy deployment zone. Mimetism, fantastic dodging, just a little bit of forward deployment, which often lets him stage in places that then let him make use of the impetuous order. Super jump for mobility. He pretty much always takes a one-way ticket straight to where your opponent least wants him to go, and tends to make a huge mess on the way through. He is, look, frankly, pretty much a true auto-include in every faction that can take him, maybe excluding Yuching only because they have a variety of other options and get a little thin on the ground in terms of available troop slots, but frankly, even then. Take him in Svalarheima Winterforce, and let's all cross our fingers and hope that he's still going to be around in N5, but I think that he probably will. Last up, in terms of memorable mention close assault pieces, we have the Beast Hunter Free Guild. This is a piece that I would be conservative with my predictions about whether or not the Beast Hunters will make it into N5 in every faction. They absolutely have appeared in a number of factions. We have seen, for example, I think they're present in O12 in N5 along with some other armies, but the Beast Hunter Free Guild is the kind of profile that until we see Svalarheimer's N5 roster, I wouldn't want to assume that he's going to be present. But in the context of N4 and hopefully in N5, Beast Hunters are very, very valuable in Svalarheima because the rest of our midfield sucks balls. There are only 3 models with actual camouflage in the entire army, and while Uma Sorensen is not terrible, she is expensive AF, and if she was the only camouflage piece in the faction, I'd be a little wary about taking her. She is actually opened up slightly by the fact that the Beast Hunter exists, because with a Beast Hunter, you can take her, Uma, and a Beast Hunter, and have 2 camouflage midfield pieces in the middle of the field, which if nothing else means that your opponent doesn't just beeline for an easy kill on a 30-point model, because it might not be a 13-point model, it might be a 17-point model with a heavy flamethrower. Now, in Svalarheima, the Panosciania unique Beast Hunter profile with that wonderful, wonderful +1 burst on the heavy flamethrower, if you can find those 2 points, absolutely take those 2 points, because the extra burst just opens up lethality plays that otherwise, like, there's always a possibility to just jank a roll and pass a save. It is much harder to pass 2 saves. And so if you're able to close in on an enemy link team or just anything, 2 heavy flamethrower saves are not usually going to be shrugged off by almost anything in the game without wearing at least some risk, and that makes the 17-point Beast Hunter a worthy upgrade over its 15-point baseline. You can also absolutely take just the Mine Layer Beast Hunter. Despite being an FTO, it doesn't actually join any fire teams to my knowledge in Winterfall, but a Mine Layer and a Flamethrower for 9 points shores up what is otherwise a significant weakness of Winterfall, which is that you don't really have anything that you're comfortable using as expendable close-in defense. Like, I don't, for example, want to use Shnarano as template defense in my deployment zone. She has much more important things to be doing, but a 9-point Beast Hunter, who is bringing both a Mine and a Heavy Flamethrower, and given we're not necessarily going to be having many other irregulars in the list, that's very tolerable as a defensive piece, and for that reason, you can very strongly consider some kind of a Beast Hunter in almost any Svalarheimer list. The only time I wouldn't take a Beast Hunter almost sort of automatically is if I'm running some kind of very heavy top end that is also taking a War Correspondent and a Tech B, for example. And as I say that out loud, I actually have remembered that Tech Bs I don't think even exist in Svalarheimer, so never mind. Yes, fill your boots, take a Beast Hunter. Even the 9-point profile adds something very, very valuable to the faction. I don't think anyone has confirmed this, but is there a way of checking to see whether the reason that Tech Bees don't exist on Svalarheimer is that it's simply too cold for their uniforms? Because that would be the reason, right? Anyway, on to the next thing. So from the very top end, bottom end of the faction to the very top end, we have Jotun, Svalarheimer's Armored Cuirassiers. I probably mispronounced that, or multiple words in that regiment name. Clocking in at an extremely affordable 87 points, Jotun they are the Armor 10 tag. They're Armor 10, BTS 9, Ballistic Skill 15 with Remote Presence. There's some other stuff that's going on, but those are the things that you need to sort of pay attention to. It is very, very durable at a very reasonable cost. It makes it a great gun for forcing gunfights because you can just keep trying until you win, because Armor 10 will get you through the worst of almost any danger. And it also makes Jotun's kind of a surprisingly good pinch ARO piece because they're just Armor 10. With courage, they will hold their position for exactly as long as you want them to and no more, and they're just durable enough that even an enemy tag spooling up a multi-HMG can really struggle to do wounds on them in any kind of a timely fashion, which makes them fantastic at sapping your opponent's order pool. Then they'll guts back into total cover, you'll repair them using an order or two on your next turn, and many of your command tokens probably, and then just move on with your game plan. Now, Jotuns are sometimes criticized for basically not being mimetism pieces, and that's kind of just a foolish criticism. Yes, it might take them one more order to win a face-to-face roll, or even two, but they will win the face-to-face roll, and the armor and the BTS is just incredibly valuable, and they're not too expensive. Like 87 points for what you get is very affordable, and that durability, the only thing that turns me off snapping the Jotun Lieutenant into most lists is the fact that you really do pay for the Lieutenant profile, because 2.5 SWC is a lot in a Pan-Oceanian faction, and we're likely to have some quite good NCOs in the back pocket, so it's kind of easier just to make a Fusilier a Lieutenant. Either way, look, the Jotun is a selling point of the faction, one of my personal favorite Pan-Oceanian tags. And if you just run it following all of the usual rules for tag play, right, like don't overextend it, dedicate a couple of orders at the end of every turn to pull it back. When you deploy it, if you do use it as an ARO piece, always deploy it in a position where it can guts back into total cover. Like follow those kind of basic rules for playing a tag, and it will fit very, very neatly into your overall plan, which is to shoot the things that you can see until those things sit down, and then launch a close assault with your good close combat elements. It fits well into Svalarheima's plan. It is another one of those pieces that is just very like friendly to newer players while you're learning to play a tag, resistant to bad luck, just generally very well rounded and a fantastic piece of armor. A little more niche, but still good enough to be in the conversation, is Maximus, who is frankly a little bit expensive, because you will absolutely be able to pay like 1 point more in many factions and get a full main battle tag, but he is very, very close to a main battle tag on a Silhouette 6 tag base, and I have a lot of time for that kind of a piece. It is hard to overstate how much easier it is to move a Silhouette 6 model around mini tables. Silhouette 6, just for some reason, tends to be the absolute sweet spot of being able to fit through spaces that maybe a Silhouette 7 wouldn't always be able to, hide behind things that a Silhouette 7 wouldn't be able to, while still being able to vault over many of the things that maybe other shorter models would have their mobility constrained by. If I was creating the platonic ideal Infinity model, it would probably be Silhouette 6 for basically that reason, and Maximus crams pretty much full main battle tag stats, especially Armor 7, which means that if he's hit by armor piercing ammunition, he's still rolling on 4, and Burst 4, Ballistic Skill 14, yes, admittedly on a multi-marksman rifle, but even those range bands have plenty of utility, particularly if we're pairing him with things like Feuerbachs and heavy machine guns. He is also a specialist and willpower 13, which is as good as we're getting in this faction. And while he is absolutely too expensive to be like, oh, I'll just take Maximus, at 71 points is a lot, but you do get kind of what you pay for, and he has many qualities that make him a really fun piece to play. If you are reaching for a tag and just one tag, I would usually recommend the Jotun. It is much more of an exemplar of Pan-Oceania's faction strengths. It's a remote presence tag with the biggest gun and the most ballistic skill. But Maximus is a piece that is well worth exploring, both in N4 and probably in N5. Now, speaking of N5, at a mere half an hour into the video, we're actually going to start jumping ship and looking at profiles that frankly aren't necessarily very interesting in N4, but potentially are interesting in N5. And that's really because we've kind of hit the limit to the things I think that are really worth covering. Like there's one or two pieces, yes, we didn't cover it in essays, etc. But if you use just some staples, the good old pantry staple Fugazi, plus the pieces that I've covered in the video so far, you can build a very, very functional Pan-Oceania Svalarheima Winter 4 list. You don't need much else that's available in the faction. Because a lot of the stuff that's available in the faction otherwise hasn't necessarily aged super well or even was that great when it released. But there are a bunch of profiles in Svalarheima that are potentially very interesting as we transition into N5, and we start with the Vaga Maximum Security team. Now, in terms of fire teams, the Varg is interesting in N5 because it's one of the few keyworded fire teams. You can combine it either with itself or with orcs as part of a Winter 4 Alpha team, and given how interesting duos are going to be in N5, the fact that that is one of our duo fire teams is something to pay attention to in the new edition. The other reason the Vaga is particularly interesting is this little albedo rule. Now, albedo has been a joke for basically as long as Infinity has existed. It is a terrible rule in N3 and N4. It is expensive. I don't know how expensive, but it absolutely blows the cost of profiles out, and it kind of does nothing. Now, strictly, in N4, albedo makes you treated as if it makes multispectral visors treat you as if you were in a zero visibility zone, which means that if you shoot them, they will suffer a penalty for shooting back, etc. They can't see you, they can't ARO against you, except that Sixth Sense in N4 is just very widely available because it's not tied to fire team purity. You can have it on any fire team that has at least 4 troops in it, which means that the overwhelming majority of the time, what albedo actually does is it lets you move past MSV ARO pieces, but as soon as you shoot them, they will shoot you back with all of the bonuses and no penalties because they'll be using Sixth Sense to fire back through using the zero visibility rules. Now, after literally 4 editions of albedo being worthless garbage, in N5, it is changing, and it is changing to a numbered penalty, probably -3 or -6. For example, Fireflies have albedo -6, which applies that penalty to ballistic skill if you are shot at by a model with either a multispectral visor or the marksmanship skill. And that is a really, really big and impactful change. Now, we don't know if it will only last for the first turn of the game like albedo does currently. I don't have any reason to suspect that it will. It looks like it's just changing to mimetism but for multispectral visors, and mimetism but for multispectral visors and marksmanship is potentially a really, really good rule because there are some MSV ARO pieces that we've seen already in N4, looking at you, Kestrel Colonial Force, Black Air, that I don't want to fight on anything like fair terms, and do want to apply a -3 or -6 to its ballistic skill. And as a result, if the Varg has either of those rules, albedo -3 or albedo -6, just having it as a piece that is no longer overcosted and actually is a decent ballistic skill element with some useful skills and some interesting profiles that can mess up something like a Black Air is really, really useful. And so, yeah, for that reason, Vaga, Maximum Security Team are pretty much top of the list in terms of stonks go up potential in N5. If you own these guys in N4, congratulations, your investment will maybe finally be paying off. Now, as mentioned, Varg can duo and have a duo that benefits from link bonuses in N5 because it is a Winter 4 Alpha team with Orc troops, and Orc troops are Orc troops are Orc troops. I do not particularly like them in N4. They break most of the compositions of links that they join except for an Orc Varg link. But in N5, that's much less of a big deal, and a Ballistic Skill 14, Armor 4, 6-2 move, Heavy Machine Gun, or Feuerback is just probably going to be a good piece to have access to. Now, we can kind of cross our fingers and hope that Orc troops get some profile changes that add things like for a regiment that has, what is that, like 15 separate profiles, Orc troops have perishingly little going on. Like, there's a single specialist in there, and all of the rest of them are just mildly different flavors of gun. That is something that it would be fantastic to see change. We'll have to see. But even if that doesn't change, good HMG in duo or good Feuerback in duo is good thing to have. I don't expect their stocks to rise in the same way that Varg will, for example, but you need something to pair with to get that sweet burst bonus, and an Orc is one of the good options to do so. Now, next up on the list of particularly exciting duo options, but maybe even other kind of link setups, we have the Holy Order of Hospital Knights. Now, these are guys that I am in love with the sculpts for, I am in love with the idea of. Frankly, if I ever wanted to play military orders, I would start playing military orders by opening up the Svalarheima Winter 4 in the army and just building a Hospital Knight team. Maybe supplementing that with some Justice Knights, which are going to be called Crux teams in N5. But the Hospital Knights are on my radar in terms of interesting duos because they have just like one really solid, really clean duo option, which is that they have a very cheap, very effective heavy machine gun, and then a doctor with either a combi rifle or a multi-rifle. Now, we don't know yet exactly how Frenzy will interact with link bonuses. It's very possible that the, Frenzy quote-unquote exploit synergy, for want of a better word, that has existed for as long as fire teams have existed, it may disappear in N5, or it's possible that all of that, fire teams suppress the Frenzy trait. That might still exist. Until we see the full rules, we won't know. Even if that is a thing that happens, Hospital Knights as kind of just a solid duo package with the heavy machine gun and then the doctor with, if you can find the 2 points, going for the multi-rifle just because AP ammunition is that useful, is just a really cool self-contained team that is hard to kill, fights well, AROs well, is difficult to jump, is good in melee, because Martial Arts 2 is still, Martial Arts 3 is also a great level to have, like it's a really great level to have in N5. But Martial Arts 2 in N5 is still the level that it adds to your CC score, which is such a big deal. Going from 21 to 24 makes a huge difference in face-to-face rolls against basically anyone. And so for a sum total of 72 points and half an SWC, you get two troops that is just a really solid duo. Specialist, redundancy, force reconstitution, it's whip 13, it's ballistic skill 14 gunfighting. I don't know if it'll be great because, again, these are still relatively expensive pieces, but I have a lot of hopes. And in terms of just thematic coolness, the Knights of the Hospital are really, really cool. Now, next up, and this, look, frankly, this is an optimistic read, is the Boig Soldiers. Now, Boig are not particularly easy to link. You can theoretically staple them onto any two other troopers in the Winter 4 beta fire teams. That's things like Kaho, Knights Hospital, etc. But so you can theoretically get burst bonuses onto the Boig, which can give you something like a Burst 3 missile launcher or a Burst 5 Mark 12, which is ballistic skill 14, armor 5, BTS 6. So you could, for example, staple a Boig soldier to that Knight Hospitaller duo that I just mentioned to turn it into a Haris and still get bonuses. I don't know if that's good. The reason why I am just kind of calling out Boig soldiers here is that they have been very close to the cusp of greatness for some time, and they are one of those profiles that it would take very, very limited changes, just some gentle tweaks, right? Maybe a little bit of survivability, a slightly fewer points, just anything like that. And you have a profile that just kind of gets thrusts into viability. Boig soldiers aren't much taken in N4 because they're just not quite good enough. And if there are profile passes across like most of the model range, we expect to see at least some changes on many things moving into N5. Boig soldiers are one of those pieces that I would recommend not just pigeonholing into, they're bad in N4, so I won't look at them in N5. They might still be bad in N5, or not necessarily bad, not quite good enough, but I'm going to choose to be just a little bit optimistic and wait and see what it is that they get. Now, the last of the troops that we're going to talk about to pay attention to in N5 is actually kind of two troops. The first is the Locust, which is on screen now, and then smash cut to the Knockin, which is really just kind of like a Locust. And what we have here, the troop archetype we're talking about is single wound, expensive, forward deploying or infiltrating, mimetism -6 pieces. Now, in N4, these pieces are bad. N4 is the age of the shotgun. Light shotguns, boarding shotguns, they are everywhere, and they are template weapons that make an absolute mockery of mimetism -6, and then they get added to all of the template weapons and mines, etc. that exist in the game already. Now, many of those things will absolutely still exist in N5. We will still have mine layers, we will still have chain rifles, we will still have flamethrowers, etc. But the fact that shotguns, if nothing else, right, shotguns were one of the most accessible template weapons throughout the entirety of N4, the fact that they are changing to not have a direct template mode means that when N5 arrives, as the meta begins to evolve and settle or not, we will want to at least pay attention to the possibility that Mimetism 6 kind of skirmishy pieces that in N4 are just too expensive because they die like anyone else to a shotgun maybe is actually solid enough to take on its own merits. And in pieces like the Knockin, we have, for 29 points, a forward deploying Ballistic Skill 12 Mimetism 6 Spitfire. We have a selection of specialist operatives. On the Locusts, we have things like Breaker Combi Rifles, Shock Marksman Rifles, etc. The Locust hackers are, look, they're still very whip 13, but breaker ammunition is breaker ammunition, and being an infiltrating mimetism -6 piece is probably still going to have some of the weaknesses, many of the weaknesses that it has in N4, but some of that vulnerability, and in particular that vulnerability if you are trying to launch a close assault against someone, might be a little more limited. Now, Locusts are still a model that is paying points for close combat 20, and that absolutely does cost you points, and they would be just better. If this model was close combat 10 and saw the associated reduction in its cost, it would probably flip overnight, even in N4, into an actually pretty solid piece. But it's not, and it won't. But between it and the Knockin, there is just the potential that some of the shotgun mania of N4 being gone in N5, and the ballistic skill benefits on big link teams, making just being able to fight linked models with Mimetism 6, etc. If we do something like we combine a Knockin Spitfire with a Vaga Albedo heavy rocket launcher piece in a link, all of a sudden we have something that can attack any kind of defensive piece, which gives us even more interesting firepower options, more ability to play the visibility game, etc. And that's something that's just worth remembering when N5 arrives in a little over 2 weeks. And with that, clocking in at slightly shorter duration for a faction focus. We're not going to quite reach the hour for this one, because this is a simple faction to explain, at least as far as I'm concerned. We have our sample N4 list. And pretty much exactly as I mentioned previously in the video, this is using only the pieces that I've covered over the course of this video, plus a couple of covered staples. We've got some Fugazi drone bots and a war correspondent, but otherwise it's everything that I talked about, because the things I talked about I like. I think this is a really solid list. You could absolutely tinker with the groups. I'm not entirely certain about the layout that we've got, but how we've got this one set up is in what is effectively an 8-10 order split, with Combat Group 1 comprising our Yotum, Lang Kai, and then the Fusilier Core, Multi-Sniper, Fusilier Paramedic, Fusilier Hacking Device, 2 Fusiliers, one of whom is the Lieutenant. This is just an N5 classic, right? N4 classic, rather. Things about it are going to change in the new edition. It may be that we just don't need a link team that is this big. The fact that the linked paramedic is not going to get a meaningful bonus from the link teams because it won't be able to hit with 2 medi darts is something that will change. So this layout absolutely might change in the new edition, but in N4 rather, it's just kind of good. It's another gun. We are packing really 4 solid, very serviceable firepower pieces in this list. 4 is a really nice number to have in Pan-Oceania, because it really just does mean we have the redundancy to keep forcing those face-to-face rolls, and one of those pieces that we have redundancy from is the Yotum. Lankai is here because he's outstanding, so this first combat group is the Fusiliers are going to provide the orders. You might take a face-to-face roll occasionally with that sniper, but otherwise what we're going to be doing is shoot things with the Yotum, or yeet Lang Kai at people, and 7 orders plus his Impetuous should be just about enough for Lang Kai to make a run. If your opponent strips orders from this group on your first turn, I would probably suggest holding Lang Kai back and just attacking things with the Jotun, but it does kind of depend on what they do and how they play. And if you practice with this list and you find, oh no, actually, my opponent stripping orders from this group and then thoroughly null deploying counters me more than I'd like, that's something that you could work in terms of group composition to move Lang Kai into the larger group if you think, if that's something that you read as being about to happen, right? If your opponent totally null deploys, it could be worth just flipping Lang Kai into the first group to have access to a higher order count. The second group, rather. The second group is our 3-person and 2-person link teams. So we have the Kaho Fusilier Angus team that I mentioned, and then the Blade Bulleteer link that I mentioned. We've then got, just to provide some orders, 2 Fugazi drone bots and a war correspondent. Now, something that is missing from this list that could be worth adding is a Beast Hunter. To find the points for a Beast Hunter, we would need to find 2 points somewhere to upgrade a Fugazi, or 6 points somewhere to upgrade the war core. That's a little more challenging without making some significant changes, but we can find 2 points in this list pretty easily, either by turning Agnes into a 12-point Fusilier piece, or by turning the Fusilier multi-sniper into a missile launcher. Either of those would give enough points to turn the Fugazi Dronbot into just a 9-point Beast Hunter, and a 9-point Beast Hunter is the kind of piece that might slot into the list quite well. So, a sample rework of the list that does include the Beast Hunter we can see on screen now. In this case, we've done it by turning the Fusilier sniper rifle into a missile launcher, and we've turned a Fugazi Dronbot into the Beast Hunter, which we've flipped into Combat Group 1. The reason why we've done that is that, firstly, it's potentially, and I like to split irregular orders when I have like this kind of irregular setup, because it means that in any given turn you can spend command tokens where you think you will need them, without being in a position where one group really needs you to spend command tokens to turn regular orders regular for it to function. But the other reason is that if your opponent does the same thing I just mentioned, where they're like, "Oh, I don't want to fight any of this crap. I'm going to null deploy my entire army and then strip orders away from the group that has Lanai in it," well, now that group potentially has more orders, and Lanai might be able to make a run anyway. But secondly, if your opponent is totally null deployed and is giving you free reign to just go and do mission things with your first combat group, you could do stuff like there'll probably still be some shots to take, maybe move the Jotun forward, take some shots, pull it back, and then with any spare orders that you have that you aren't using to maybe stage Lanai into the midfield, you can just lay mines with the Beast Hunter and move it up and around and be annoying. So in either case, I think both versions of this list are solid. The sniper rifle version gives you marginally more offensive redundancy. If you wanted to retain the sniper rifle, you could just turn Agnes into something like, say, a Fusilier forward observer. And in either case, this change gives you a Beast Hunter, and the Beast Hunter gives you slightly more defensive depth. In either case, what we're looking at here is pretty much the all-star of N for Svalarheima. Very good gunfighting, fantastic order pools, multiple tactical awareness and NCO orders, which gets us to 18 orders total in the list. Solid close assault, although this list absolutely could have more close assault in it if I wanted it to. I haven't included Shona or Gunnar, but I do have Agnes, who kind of counts as close assault, and of course the superlative Lanai. And otherwise just a very well-rounded list that can basically play many of the high notes of N4 and isn't really particular. It's pretty good in basically every scenario in the game. The only thing that I might not... No, look, I'd play this in Panic Room, I'd play this in Biotech Vor. I'd even be completely comfortable playing this in Frostbite. You just make the Kaho into the Frost operator, and at that point we've got well north of 110 points that we could slam into a zone at the end of the game if we needed to. If it absolutely had to, this list could even play something like Highly Classified, although I would probably consider maybe tailoring a list for that scenario a little bit more, but if you put a gun to my head and said play this in Highly Classified, I absolutely would, and it pretty much could. And with that, that wraps up this faction focus for Svalarheima Winter Force. As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Very much significant thanks to everyone who has so far. I take video requests, faction focus requests, faction to play and battle reports, etc. requests from channel supporters, either those who donate via Buy Me a Coffee or those who are ongoing channel supporters on YouTube. In terms of future content, we are now at less than 3 weeks away from N5 arriving in full. I'm in the process of organizing my first event for N5, which will be happening sometime in December. There might be battle reports for that when it comes, we'll see. And otherwise, just trying to figure out what kind of content to cover as we close out and then begin the new and old editions. If you've got anything that you would be particularly interested in seeing covered in the last days of N4, or you think would be good topics to discuss in the early days of N5, please do let me know, because that kind of inspiration is super useful. But otherwise, as always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.